Oban, the ferry of the Caledonian Line, sails into the harbour. The line connects the mainland of Scotland with the Hebrides, from where one sails to the Isle of Mull. The small town of Oban nestles in the bay. Once an important trading port, it is today essentially a ferry harbour with about 8,000 inhabitants. The ferry sails several times daily from Oban to Craignure on Mull. The trip takes about an hour and takes you past numerous other small islands. Starting in Oban, the journey through the north of Scotland goes via Mull on its way up to Inverness, then along the north coast to John O'Groats and south to Ballindalloch. After about 3/4 of an hour, the Isle of Mull is already in sight. The little village of Craignure, the landing port, is tiny, with only a few houses, a petrol station and a camping ground. From the sea, one would hardly know that there was a village here at all, or even a port. Just behind Craignure, the beautiful Talisker Castle is to be admired. The castle is 150 years old, typically Scottish and surrounded by beautiful gardens. It was completed in 1858 and until now was used by the family for private purposes, but it's now also open to the public. In the immediate vicinity is Urquhart Castle, a 13th century building and the seat of the MacLean clan. In 1647 it was successfully defended against the forces of the Campbell clan. In 1653 Cromwell with 6 ships also failed to conquer it. Not until 1678 was the castle taken and the MacLeans had to flee. In 1751, the castle was abandoned, and from 1801 onwards it was sold several times over. It was not until 1911 that the castle was reacquired by the MacLeans, who had it restored. In 1999, it served as the setting for a Sean Connery film, who, by the way, has MacLean ancestors on his mother's side. It had already been used as a backdrop for an Anthony Hopkins film too, in 1971. The island of Mull is sparsely populated and full of glorious and beautiful nature. Armadale Castle on Skye is the property of the MacDonald family. The castle is, in large part, only preserved as a ruin. The MacDonalds resided here from 1650 to 1690. In 1815 the property was historicised, but 40 years later it was destroyed by a fire. However, parts of all 3 phases of construction are preserved, but only as ruins, except for the north wing, which is still usable. This was restored in 1970. Today, the castle is mainly known for its garden, in which there are many exotic plants that thrive wonderfully in the mild Gulf Stream. Also on Skye is the Talisker distillery. This whisky distillery was founded in 1830 by two brothers. After their death, a businessman took over the production, but went bankrupt very quickly. The next owner suffered the same fate and was imprisoned in 1880 for fraud. The following owners had more luck. They built up the distillery again and reached a production volume of 40,000 gallons per year. In 1928, the distillery changed its manufacturing process from a 3 times distilling process to just twice. In November 1960, the factory was destroyed by fire. It was caused by an overflowing of distillate, which was sparked by the coal fire and set the building alight. In 1962, the distillery was faithfully reconstructed to preserve the original flavour of the whisky. The Talisker is a double-distilled single malt whisky. From the distillery, you have a beautiful view of the Loch Harport, which is also the ship's landing stage. On the northwest of Skye there is Dunvegan Castle with a small seal colony. Picturesque, the castle is situated on the loch like a film set. The location is simply fantastic. The surrounding area of the loch invites a wonderful walk. The seal colony is located at the foot of the castle, and from the shore, and with a good telescope or binoculars, it's fascinating to watch them. For those who want to watch the seals at close range, you can take a boat trip from the castle. The castle itself is not spectacular, not even the garden, but the boat ride is well worth the admission fee. From the main entrance, a path winds along down to the jetty. This is where the tours start, with boats sailing in at 15-minute intervals. The trip takes about half an hour and takes you up close to the seal banks. The trained and very witty skipper informs you about the seals and other live animals, and also tells you about the bird life here. A good example is the attitude of the skipper to prevent any disturbance. If the animals are disturbed, they tend to leave the area.
These are common seals, or harbour seals. And you get grey seals, which are about 3 times.
Back at the jetty, there is still a beautiful view of the castle. Today's view is the result of the renovations and extensions that were carried out during the Victorian period. For this new building work, undertaken from 1840 to 1850, the Scottish architect Robert Brown was responsible. Dunvegan Castle is one of the few castles that, since its first construction and up to the present day, more than 700 years, it has been in the possession of the MacLeod family. It's the longest privately inhabited castle in Britain. The castle was designed as a defence and therefore built on a rock in the sea with a bridge to the mainland. The impressive exterior consists of 6 buildings. One of them and all the upper floors are reserved for the administration and the private rooms of the family, and so cannot be visited. At the corners of the building there are built small bays, which, however, are only for decoration. Another of its strong points is the fact that it has a freshwater spring. With this interplay of water supply and strategic position on the island, the castle was able to survive 850 years without damage. The trip to the north now leads past beautiful lochs, Loch Carron, Loch Croisg, Loch Marie, until you reach Inverewe Garden. Superbly located at Loch Ness, which is actually a sea bay, this garden is the most northerly botanic garden in the world. With its ideal location on the northwest coast of Scotland, right on the warm Gulf Stream, it can produce completely atypical vegetation, considering its geographical position. Inverewe lies at 57.8 degrees north latitude, or roughly on the same level as the Hudson Bay in Canada or southern Norway. Thus it has year-round constant high temperature. Particularly interesting and extensive are the collections of the different species of rhododendron, eucalyptus trees and plants from all continents. The founder of the garden was the Scot Osgood Mackenzie. When he inherited about 20 acres of land, it was a rocky hill with only a single tree. Because the land is located directly on the seafront, it was also completely exposed to the weather conditions. Mackenzie started the site by planting local Scottish and Scandinavian pine trees. These protect the land from any severe weather conditions. In addition, a vast quantity of soil was brought in, supposedly from Ireland, with which the soil was enriched. As time went by, different plants were brought in, both from the north as well as collections from the southern hemisphere. His special focus was on the walled garden, a walled piece of former beach on which were planted different crops. When Osgood Mackenzie died in 1922, the garden was taken over by his daughter, Mary Sawyer. In 1935, she and her second husband built the current Inverewe house after the original was destroyed by fire. Shortly before her death in 1953, Mary Sawyer arranged for the garden to be taken over by the National Trust of Scotland, who have cared for it up until today. Originally a very remote place, it is now, with increasing development in Scotland, a popular destination and is visited annually by over 200,000 people. In the vicinity of Inverewe Garden is Corrieshalloch Gorge. A daring suspension bridge spans the Corrieshalloch Gorge. It was built by Sir John Fowler, who with Sir Benjamin Baker built the railway bridge over the Forth. The 1.6-kilometre long gorge is 65 metres deep and was cut deeply into the rock from the small river over millions of years. Farther and farther to the north are the Scottish Highlands. Highlands just means the mountains in the north. The Highlands are separated from the plains by a rift valley and were exposed to British influence less than the lowlands. Thus they have preserved better their own cultural character. In particular, the clan structure in the Highlands is still partially alive today. Its clans and its whisky production have made Scotland world famous. The present appearance of the Highlands, vast, treeless and uninhabited areas, is largely a consequence of the Highland clearances and the eviction of the resident population during the period from 1762 until 1884. Inverewe Castle is situated on Loch Ness, surrounded by beautiful mountains. The castle was built around 1590 by the MacLeod clan, which had owned the loch and the surrounding area since the 13th century. The castle was attacked and conquered in 1672, and a second building was erected at the castle. Both were burnt down in 1737 under mysterious circumstances and have since remained in ruins. The north-westerly point of the Highlands can be reached in Inverness. Here one can well understand the difference between high and low tide. At high tide, the entire sandy area is covered with water. The sparse population here also stems from the time of the Highland clearances. The people were displaced in order to ensure a nationwide sheep farming area. This was carried out by the landlords, some with violence, and in a rather short time the Highlands were evacuated. Those displaced were indeed the indigenous peoples, but also landless peasants and tenant farmers, some of whom had lived for generations on this site. Often whole villages were disbanded and their huts destroyed. The displaced were herded onto emigrant ships and shipped to North America or Australia. Land was left then to a few sheep farmers from the Scottish lowlands or from England. Today you can still see, grazing on the pasture land, Scottish Highland cattle. These are small in stature, relatively easy, good-natured, robust and durable. This land is suitable for year-round free-range grazing, with soil that cannot tolerate the heavy cattle. Another advantage is that the cattle calve easily, so don't require human intervention. The longhorns are gender-specific. The bulls have the tips curved forwards, the cows upwards. At the northernmost point of Scotland, on John O'Groats, is the Dunnet Head Lighthouse, which stands on a 90-metre high cliff. The lighthouse is 105 metres high and was built in 1831 by Robert Stevenson. Here also a defence plant was built during World War II. From here, it's not far to Duncansby Head. The cliffs are impressive. The Great Stack rises 60 metres high and was formed during the Ice Age. On the cliffs, birds live in colonies, including puffins. A charming place is the small fishing town of Helmsdale, which is known mainly for its time span museum, which takes the visitor back in time. Dunrobin Castle is an interesting castle. It's the seat of the Sutherland family. With 189 rooms, it's the largest residential building in the Northern Highlands. The core of the house part of it goes back to a tower dating from the 13th century. Dunrobin was first mentioned in 1401 as a fortress. In the 17th century, 2 new wings were added to the old castle, which were connected to the old building by a tower with a spiral staircase. During the period from 1845 to 1851, the castle received its present shape, reminiscent of a French chateau. Many celebrities have visited the place. For instance, in 1872, Queen Victoria slept here. In the late 60s and early 70s, the castle served for 7 years as a boys' boarding school. Today, it is again used for private purposes by the Countess of Sutherland. The castle is open to the public from April till October. The garden, which is modelled on Versailles, is open all year round. On the Moray Firth, there is a dolphin observation point. There's a lighthouse here, and as you can see, in the parking lot, a large crowd has already gathered for a view of the dolphins. Considering the vastness of the water and the high waves, it is hard to imagine that we will get a good sight of the dolphins, certainly not without binoculars. But the row of parked cars, filled with people who keep their binoculars trained on the sea, assures us that sightings are possible and are not uncommon. One of the larger towns on the Moray Firth is Inverness. The Free North Church on the river features the silhouette of Inverness. Although it's not particularly famous, it is a striking focal point of the city. Outstanding is its slender tower, which distinguishes it from the many other churches in the city. The building is of a classic brick structure with a nave and a steep roof. The slender tower is mounted on the side and is divided into segments, so it's a bit like a modular system. Also, on the River Ness is the Baptist Church. Across the river stands the castle. This red sandstone castle was built in 1836 on the remains of a fortification dating from the 14th century. Today it is occupied by the offices of the law. A series of castles have been here since 1057. The first palace was destroyed by King Robert I. Its successive structure was then destroyed in the 15th century, but in 1427 it had gained fame, or perhaps notoriety, when James I held a meeting here with the clan chiefs, of whom 3 called for independence. They were executed right on the spot. In 1548, another castle by George Gordon was completed here, which was occupied by Queen Mary's allies. The following story was heard. The Queen was refused admission to the castle. after which her faithful leaders of the clans Fraser and Munro conquered the castle for Queen Mary, and she then had the governor, who had refused her admittance, hanged. In Inverness begins the legendary mystical story of the Loch Ness monster. Towards the end of the Ice Age, about 12,000 years ago, Loch Ness was probably still just a bay. Today, Loch Ness is 39 kilometres long, 1.5 kilometres wide and 226 metres deep. It is, after Loch Lomond, Scotland's second largest lake and the largest freshwater reservoir in Britain. Since 1822, the loch has been part of the Caledonian Canal. This was built as a canal connecting the Atlantic and North Sea coast in order to achieve shorter journey times and to escape the storms at sea in the north of Scotland. The loch's fame, however, derives from sightings of the Loch Ness monster. Since 1880, there have always been reported but unconfirmed sightings of Nessie. The centre of worship, if we can use that term, is at Drummadrochit. Here is a Nessie information centre with a multimedia show and all the facts and fantasies about the most likely non-existent monster there ever was. But who can say? The cult flourishes. There's a hotel with a souvenir shop, children's entertainment centre, and everything that generates money through and by the myth of the Loch Ness monster. Nothing moves on the lake. For the disappointed, there is at least a Nessie sculpture. It travels underwater on rails and turns in a circle in a pool of water, which thus stimulates the visitor's imagination. Well, in any case, this myth has become an important source of Scottish revenue because the lake is now one of the main destinations for tourism in Scotland. Nessie's sighting boats leave tirelessly up and down the loch and sell the hope of a sighting. Unlikely. Looking at the statistics of the alleged sightings, the time intervals are long as just to keep the myth alive. Real and very beautiful is Urquhart Castle at the loch. The story begins in the 6th century, when there was already a fortress here. It's not known, however, when the castle itself was originally built. It's likely that it was built around 1230 by the Durwood family. There is evidence that it existed in 1296, when it was conquered by Edward I. In 1509, it was given to the Grants, who held it until 1912. However, before that, in 1662, it was destroyed to prevent the Jacobites settling here. They must have succeeded in doing so, because it was never restored. The main entrance is on the landward side. There's also a small gate from the lake. Interesting to see is the main tower of 5 floors with a top-mounted battlement. About halfway down the loch, on the long side, there is Fort Augustus with its huge lock system. The loch is the largest of the 29 lochs on the Caledonian Canal, which connect with each other to a length of 97 kilometres, more than one loch. Only about 1/3 of the canal was artificially created. It starts in Inverness and goes through the Moray Firth, the River Ness, Loch Dochfur, Loch Ness, River Oik, Loch Oik, Loch Lochy, Loch Linney and the Firth of Lorne. For its construction, the famous Scottish engineer Thomas Telford was responsible. It was built from 1803 to 1822. The project served, at the time of the Highland clearances, as a creation of new jobs. The canal didn't achieve its economic importance as was expected. Today, it's used mainly for tourism. Another landmark in Fort Augustus is the Benedictine Abbey. The monastery was in operation from 1876 to 1999. In 1876, Jerome Vaughan and Anselm Robertson, a monk from Regensburg, founded St. Benedict's Abbey, here in Fort Augustus. The building was a fort, and after it was no longer needed for military purposes, it was sold by the government to the noble Lord Lovat. For a while it was the owner's hunting residence. In 1876, the Benedictine monks bought the property, and parts of it were torn down. Other parts were used for building material. In 1880 it was consecrated. The new parts are typical buildings of the 19th century, built in English Gothic Revival style. Only the construction of the church was stopped in 1893 because of lack of funds. The Abbey Church was completed only in the 1970s, but in 1878 a boarding school was established here for 70 students. Although the school had a good reputation, it was closed in 1993. In 1996, there were still 17 monks, 13 priests and 2 brothers here, but in January 1999, the monastery was finally closed. A wonderful natural setting is the Glenmore Forest Park, where numerous lakes and rivers run through the forest area. It also has a recreational space and sports facilities, ranging from water sports to rock climbing. The area is also famous for its whisky production. Most well known is the Tormore distillery, which is owned by the Shivas brothers. It's one of the older distilleries on the River Spey, a preferred location for whisky producers because of its water. With the whisky production, it is also indirectly related to Ballindalloch Castle because of its supply of agricultural products. The castle probably dates from the 16th century. Certainly the main tower dates from this period. In the house, in one of the bedrooms, there's a stone wall which bears the date 1546, so one can infer a possible construction year. The castle is one of the few in Scotland which is still privately owned and in which a single family has lived from its origins up to today. The castle was originally traditionally built in a Z shape, but was rebuilt and enlarged several times. The castle is a typical representation of a transitional form of fortified towered castle, which changed over the years to become a customary 16th century and then an elegant and comfortable Victorian livable castle. The castle is often described as the Pearl of the North, not just because of its architecture, but also because it has retained its usage as a family home. The property is also a business. It is run by the family with about 40 full-time professional and part-time staff. It consists of a farm, a forest and a golf course. The aim of the family is to maintain a broad spectrum of economic activities in this rural area in order to ensure the survival of such a property as this. The Macpherson Grant family has also been heavily involved in the breeding of Angus cattle. The north of Scotland is a very special area. Above all, it is the Highlands which draw visitors to return and return. The mountains and lakes are what make Scotland so distinctive, but also the palaces, the castles and the gardens which enthrall travellers again and again and make them want to return to the enchanting north of Scotland.